Today, we're going to talk about drugs. Today, let's discuss drug use for grown-ups by Dr. Kyle Hart. Let's see what it's all about. How are you all going, guys? Welcome back to Walk It Off. I'm your host, Nathan. Today we're going to be talking about drugs. Specifically, we're going to be reviewing this book right here, Drug Use for Grown-Ups by Dr. Kyle Hart. It's one that I've wanted to talk about for quite some time, as I think that drugs and drug use tie quite significantly into the modern mental health discussion, and it's not something that we should be avoiding, even though it's been historically a bit of a taboo topic. We are adults and we need to be able to discuss anything. If there is a problem and we want to find the solution to it, not talking about it is not going to help us in any way, shape or form. So without further ado, let's talk about it. Dr. Karl L. Hart is the Ziff Professor of Psychology in the Departments of Psychology and Psychiatry at the Columbia University. He is also a research scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. Professor Hart has published numerous scientific and popular articles in the area of neuropsychopharmacology, and is the co-author on another book called Drugs, Society and Human Behavior. Now, like quite a few of the authors that I've reviewed here, I found Dr. Kyle Hart on the Joe Rogan podcast, and Joe is not particularly shy about his drug use. He is quite an avid pot smoker, enjoys a good whiskey, and yes, is quite into psychedelics. Now, to be quite frank, growing up through my 20s, I was very much a bit of a psychonaut. What I'm here to talk about is how we need to break the stigma of drug use as adults, because it's stuff that we need to talk about. And I don't like to review a book and then suddenly talk about another one, but there's a really, really good quote in Waking Up by Sam Harris. And what he says, more or less, is that drugs, as a word, is pretty much useless because it doesn't describe what they are at all. And there is a plethora of psychoactive compounds that we use the word drug for, but then we also use the word drug to describe stuff like paracetamol, which is kind of bizarre. I mean, they're both can be thought of as a type of medicine in that regard, but it's just interesting how there seems to be one set of rules for things that have come out of the pharmaceutical industry, and anything that is kind of more of a street drug, it has this kind of negative language attached to it. When you break these drugs down on a scientific and chemical level, you'll find that they are identical. Like, I'm not sure how many people actually know this, but when I was in high school, there was a few ADD kids that used to sell what we referred to as Dexies. Now, if you don't know what Dexies are, they're essentially methamphetamine. And we are prescribing that to kids in order to try and make them sit still, which I can't really wrap my head around, to be quite honest. But drugs are ubiquitous in human culture. They are more or less, besides language, one of the few kind of ubiquitous traits. I mean, family structures change, language structures change, and can be quite significantly different. But lots of human cultures have used drugs in a kind of psycho-spiritual sense. Like, they use psychoactive compounds in rituals to induce a sense of euphoria, and it kind of, I imagine it stimulates pair bonding and group peer bonding quite well. But yeah, these drugs have traditionally been quite taboo and more or less illegal, which I've always found really fascinating from the standpoint of both caffeine and alcohol are two psychoactive compounds. We don't refer to them as drugs, but they clearly are. And just the social stigma around something like marijuana usage, which is kind of shunned, but at the same time we actively promote alcohol use. Like there used to be booze ads and sponsorships on sports players' chests and things like that. And I mean, you can say what you will about pot making people dumber, but I can't seem to find any instance of a pot smoker getting stoned and then going out and coward punching someone in the back of the head and killing them. It just doesn't happen. I mean, the furthest place they're going to go is the nearest source of munchies. So the other interesting idea that Karl talks about in here, and it kind of echoes my own thoughts, but I'd never really kind of condensed them down into something that I could really articulate, and that is the concept of the gateway drugs. And I mean, most people would turn around and say that pot is the gateway drug, and I completely disagree with that fundamentally. I'm pretty certain that sugar is the actual gateway drug. I mean, it's the first thing that I can remember lying to my mum about in order to try and get. And I think that should be kind of like the reason you're taking it is to try and make yourself feel good. That right there is a clear signifier of it being a drug. I mean, you're taking it to induce an effect in your body. And that to me is the real definition of what a drug actually is. We cannot stop our children from having access to these things, period. Doesn't matter how badly you outlaw them. And I'd say that the fact that they're illegal kind of gives them a forbidden fruit angle, which a lot of teenagers can't really resist. But as Karl details in here, we can't stop drugs getting into our maximum security prisons. So what makes you think that we can keep them off the street? Like, I want you to just kind of simmer on that for a little bit. If you get caught with a small amount of pot, in some states of America, that's almost like a life sentence. And you're fucking that person's life up 10 ways to Sunday. They are never going to be a productive member of the economy ever again. How is that useful to anybody? So the American government is still spending $35 billion plus a year trying to enforce the completely unenforceable. They can't keep drugs and illicit substances out of maximum security prisons, and that you're still spending $35 billion on trying to keep it off the streets. That's just a joke. I mean, imagine what you could do pouring $35 billion into education. And I think that's where it needs to be spent. Because if more people are educated about the downsides of these drugs, a lot less people might be tempted to take them in the first place. So essentially what Dr. Karl studies is the long-term positive and negative effects of drugs on the drug user, and how susceptible to addiction each individual drug is, or how susceptible a user is to addiction based on the drug that they're taking, and also the environment around them. And that's made it very challenging to study. For, I think it's the last 10 years, he's been experimenting on drug use in general, whether to find there is any long-term negative effects for pot use, and whether even the addictability of hard drugs like heroin and methamphetamine. And some of his research has concluded, although the anecdotal evidence or the stories people tell about these drugs will tell you the complete opposite of his findings. And he found that most even hard drugs like heroin and methamphetamine are not actually as addictive as we think that they are. And addiction itself, while the most part of this book is not about addiction, but he would be amiss if he didn't talk about it, but essentially most drugs become addictive because of the environmental factors around the person taking them. And with my own experiences with amphetamines, and that's kind of what I got addicted to when I was at my worst, is that depression and hard drugs are never a good mix. So I had undiagnosed depression for a good part of my life, and you have a cascade of a few terrible things happen in your life, and you will look for anything that can make you numb. And it was extremely difficult to pull myself out of that self-destructive spiral. But I did it through reading and hiking and essentially getting back, kind of bringing out my inner child and saying to myself, what are the best parts of myself, and just letting those come back to the surface. And the only way that I could ever see us kind of winning the war on this stuff is to legalize and decriminalize it. I'm pretty sure it's Portugal has had absolutely amazing results from decriminalizing these, and especially in America, I think it's got a lot to do with the private prison system, in that the people who are running the system get paid more for the more people they cram in there. So there's this weird incentive structure to kind of criminalize drugs as much as possible in order to make as much money as possible, which is an absolutely disgusting way of doing things, in my opinion. You're essentially screwing a very large percentage of your population in order to just so you can make a bit of money. Like, as far as I'm concerned, that's actually just as bad, if not worse, than the people making the drugs in the first place. I mean, at least they're honest about what they're doing. If you decriminalize, essentially what you're doing is removing all of the toxic parts that cause the harm surrounding drugs, right? And then, I mean, especially when you take something like pot, for instance, how much money could the government be making if they legalized and taxed it? I'm pretty certain that in Colorado, it went from illegal to being a $30 billion a year industry pretty much overnight. I mean, it still has some of the dodginess involved in it because you've got to contend with the Mexican cartels from the south, but again, and you can put that back into crime prevention and education. I mean, it seems like a no-brainer as far as I'm concerned. And Dr. Karl talks about it quite a lot in his book. So one of the parts I quite enjoyed is Dr. Karl's opinion on the idea of using things like psychedelics to treat mental health. He speaks at some length on some of the studies that he knows about but have been hard to conduct due to the illegality of the substance. To my knowledge, things like psilocybin and MDMA. Psilocybin is the psychoactive compound in magic mushrooms, and MDMA is the technical name for the psychoactive compound in the street drug ecstasy. And both of these drugs can be used quite well in small doses for treating things like depression. The way I've heard about it used, especially MDMA, is being used to treat post-traumatic stress syndrome in returned soldiers and veterans from the Iraq War, in that they found it very difficult to open up with the therapist, but by microdosing MDMA before the therapy session, it enables the people to open up much easier, and yeah, there doesn't seem to be any kind of withdrawal symptoms when done in a microdose scientific setting. These things aren't done in like the party drug fashion, but they are done in a very clinical setting, and there is someone there to look after you and that type of thing. So I think that we are missing out on a lot of potential, and the scary thing is like I said earlier, is that the pharmaceutical companies have known about the therapeutic and the potential good that some of these chemicals can do, and they've hidden it from the world and called them other things, but essentially they're more or less chemically exactly the same as the street drugs. They're just a cleaner variety. So one of the main ideas that Dr. Karl talks about in this book, and one of the main ones I wanted to address with you today, is just the concept of human bodily autonomy and sovereignty. And I think that's an extremely relevant topic considering the last 2 years that we've all gone through, in that I don't think it's the government's place or anybody else's but mine to tell me what I can and cannot put in my body. And yeah, I think everybody's got the right to choose. I mean, I'm never going to force any of this stuff on anybody, and to be quite honest, I would be... I can't say I'm not going to be disappointed if I hear about my kids getting into some of this stuff, but at the same time, my job as a father is to educate them as much as possible to make the right choices. And I mean, at the end of the day, most people want to experience something that isn't their everyday consciousness. I mean, otherwise there wouldn't be any reason to take any of this stuff. But it can be done in a positive manner, and I think we should genuinely encourage anything that's going to expand the consciousness of human beings in a positive way. Now, that's not to say there isn't huge amounts of risk with taking these things, but that risk can be reduced and it can be educated away. And if you can get access to clean and pharmaceutical grade versions of these substances, then that removes huge amounts of the risk that's involved with street drug usage. And ultimately, from my experience and everything that I've read in books like this, the risk of addiction in someone who's got their shit together is actually quite low. So make your mind up for yourself, guys. So it is time to wrap this one up. I would love to know, have you read Drug Use for Grown-Ups by Dr. Kyle Hart? If you have, I want to talk to you about it in the comments below. I know this is a really contentious subject, and some of you might not want to talk too deeply about your own experiences with drugs, so I'm more than happy for you to swap out names if you need to. I completely understand about the potential for reputation destruction in talking honestly about something like this, which I don't really agree with, because let's face it, we're all adults, and if you have a beer every day after work or a coffee every morning, you're a daily drug user. I'm sorry, but you are. And I think we all need to more honestly talk about it. So as usual, guys, I'm Nathan. This has been Walk It Off. I hope you've enjoyed this chat on a taboo topic, and there might be more to come, but yeah, I think that this is something we desperately need to have honest conversation around. Otherwise, we can't solve the problems involved in it. So, I beg you, make up your own mind when it comes to drugs. And don't be so quick to judge people, because you don't know their story, you don't know what they've been through. And chances are, what's the saying? There but for a flip of a coin go I. There is no statement in all of the English language that is truer than that. So yeah, let's move forward with compassion and understanding. I'm Nathan. This is Walk It Off. I hope you've enjoyed our discussion about Dr. Kyle Hart's Drug Use for Grown-Ups. I very highly recommend this book. It might just change the way you think, which I think everybody could use. Catch you next time, guys.